Now, if you do a simple search about cancer, you'll see stats such as this, that 1 in 2 of us will get cancer. But the good news is that cancer treatment has improved significantly over recent years. Now, joining me here is Devinder, who is, I guess, could you go by the title of a scientific medical professional? How does that sound?
Yeah, I'm a clinical scientist, so yeah, that's about right. Yeah, go on. Go
Excellent.
on. Makes me sound
Yeah.
better.
So, you work at a hospital, but the thing about you is that you bring in the science with the medicine, and you're also a Christian. So you're the perfect person to be talking about this, really, and helping us look at these stats that we've got here, but also looking at how treatment is constantly developing, which is really interesting because although we've said that 1 in 2 people will get cancer, the actual treatment rates, well, successful treatment rates, have improved significantly, haven't they?
They have. So just to give you a couple of statistics, so since the mid-80s, breast cancer mortality rate, so that's people who are dying of breast cancer, they've decreased by 45% in the UK. And you can find that statistic on Breast Cancer UK. And one for the gentleman as well. So in the 70s, if you got diagnosed with prostate cancer, about a quarter of you would survive 10 years beyond that diagnosis. But by the 2010s, so this is, and obviously it's improved since then, more than 8 in 10 of you, so 80% of you will be looking to survive that diagnosis after 10 years. So you can see, even in the last couple of decades, there's been a massive improvement in cancer treatment and outcomes.
And what's caused this change? Is it funding, or is it just the fact that we now know more about cancer?
It's a mix. So yeah, obviously it's become sort of a bigger issue. So I think there is funding now and particularly, and that's helped sort of bring new things into the NHS. So immunotherapy being one. There's been a lot of, I work in the field of radiotherapy, and there's been a huge amount of development in the field of radiotherapy that makes treatments even more precise. So things like we can look within the body whilst the radiation's being delivered and check it's going to the right place. That's going to improve patient outcomes. A major part is screening. So that's when you test a healthy but at-risk population, so people who don't have symptoms, and you're just seeing if they've got any early stages of anything. And that's meant that we've picked up, for example, with breast cancer, it means that we're picking up cancers very early and at a point where actually not a lot of interventions required comparatively to just sort of fight that cancer and get it in remission. So yeah, there's a few things working together to sort of form that optimistic picture.
And a few friends of mine, the doctors have said that actually if you'd have had this cancer maybe 5, certainly 10 years ago, you wouldn't have been alive now. But because of the developments in things like immunotherapy, which seems, as an untrained professional like me, who knows absolutely nothing about this profession, just tell us about that, because that seems to be a real game changer for many people.
Yeah, so I don't know a huge amount about immunotherapy. It's not quite my field of expertise, but it is something that sort of in the last few years has been sort of brought in as an additional treatment a lot of the time. So what I mean by that is it's not the only treatment. It's often used in conjunction with other things. And it's in terms of the broad brushstrokes of it, you're essentially aiding the body's ability to fight the cancer off. So you've got your immune system that is quite good at fighting things off. It's the way it's designed. So if you get a disease into your body, let's say it's a flu virus or something, your immune system kicks in to try and overcome that. With cancer, it's quite good at hiding, and also it can lay your system quite low. So what we're looking to do with immunotherapy is essentially just give the system a bit of a leg up in order to help it do what it should be doing.
And do you think that there's things that we're doing now that we'll look back at in about 10, 20 years and think, well, clearly that wasn't healthy for us? Because a fine example is smoking, isn't it? You can actually still look on YouTube of adverts where there was doctors endorsing smoking, saying it, opens up your lungs and it helps you and it takes away the stress. And now, of course, we're thinking, maybe maybe they shouldn't have been doing that. And the same with things like asbestos. There was an advert I saw from about the 1940s, and it was saying it was this incredible invention where it will do everything. It's heat proof, it's strong, and we should have it everywhere. And now, of course, quite the opposite. So let's talk about this. Do you think, from a professional in this industry, that there's things that we're currently doing that we'll look back at and just think, I can't believe that was allowed?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So it's hard to predict kind of the way science will, kind of the latest science, where that will take us. But it's interesting when you look at the fact that things get brought in, like you say with smoking, and they're sort of endorsed, and then, research later kind of rolls back and sort of steps back a bit on that. Things that kind of strike me, but it's not exactly new to anyone, is so for example, we now are getting more research on these ultra processed foods, so foods that are very convenient but often have lots of ingredients, lots of processing, and there's a lot more research now sort of coming out about the effect of those on the human body. And what is particularly interesting about that is that it's not an easy dilemma, because people have resorted to these, well, we call them UPFs, so let's shorten it just for ease. People resort to it because of our busy lifestyles. We're often going from A to B, thinking about a few things at the same time. And so these foods were designed to give us a convenient way of getting nutrition in. So we talk about the UPFs being the primary thing that we're concerned about, but actually, I suppose then that goes back to our busy lifestyles. That leads us to eat this sort of food. A lot of us are increasingly sedentary. I know I sit for about 8-9 hours a day, and that also, that reduced amount of getting out, exercising, is probably something that isn't great. And I wonder, because our society has sort of increasingly gone that way, particularly in the UK, we don't do a lot of that primary or secondary manufacturing, farming stuff anymore, or jobs that require us to get out and about. And there's not a huge amount of them. A lot of us are sitting in our desk chairs. So yeah, it does make you wonder. But like I say, the optimistic half of that is that we are finding out more and more. And so, yeah, there's always stuff out there about, well, actually, we're finding this as a link now. So there's information for us to take in about that.
I guess we assume, don't we, that the hunter-gatherer phase of humanity, they were so healthy, they never had any of these conditions. But I guess we haven't got much evidence to say that, have we? That if you just lived on an island and you ate fresh fish and you lived off the land, we can't just say, oh, well, they wouldn't have got cancer. Or can we say that?
It's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, one thing we perhaps do know is that perhaps their life expectancy wasn't as high as perhaps the sort of years that we're enjoying now. And I suppose the longer you live, the more likely you are to pick up things like cancer and so on. So it's hard to say, was it a lifestyle-based thing, or is it just something about the fact that we're living longer now, so that likelihood just over your lifetime of getting cancer increases? And you always have to be careful about things that we sort of go, oh, the old way was the good way. Because, yeah, they wouldn't have had things like, healthcare, or they might have had knowledge of plants, and, some sort of that knowledge of, oh, this seems to help this thing. But yeah, it's nothing to the stage of where we are now with healthcare. And as you say, there's just we can only build so much of a picture of what their life was like. We can't possibly say a lot about day to day.
I guess there could be an argument as well that people were potentially dying of these conditions, but they were undiagnosed. So we actually didn't know why these people were dying. Maybe it could have been cancer, or maybe it could have been such illnesses. So you mentioned that you are a Christian, both you and your husband are. And I always love asking scientists this question, because there seems to be a debate that science can't go together with faith. So just tell us a little bit about how you fell in love with science and in particular physics, because as a Christian, I'd say that that's God placing it on your heart.
So I kind of came at it from so I was a scientist first, and I became a Christian in my mid 20s. So it actually happened for me that way round, and the perspective I kind of gained from it was that actually I see science as a way of studying God's creation, and essentially I see the world, and what, through my study I've been given certain tools to interrogate that world around me, and then I can use that to sort of praise God. So there's a scientist called Mary Schweitzer, and she's got a quote that I'm going to paraphrase with, I really love, and she says something along the lines of, the more I study the science, the bigger God gets, because you realise just how clever, I mean, I say clever, like God's clever. Obviously, he's masses beyond any of us, but it really gives you an appreciation. Like coming from that background, it gives you an appreciation of, wow, this is a great God. When you look at atoms, when you look at things that happen, the phenomena that happen, the stars, the radiation, which I work with a lot. Yeah, you get an appreciation of, wow, God, you've made this. This was all in the world far before I came along, and far before, anyone could really understand it. And it's just been there, waiting to be unearthed, waiting to be looked at. And I think that's really beautiful.
It is beautiful, but I want to also touch upon the difficult topic of illness. So we hear stories where there's been a family, for example, who have followed God all their life, and then their child dies of cancer. And we've also had stories, some friends of mine, where they've been diagnosed with cancer and everybody's been praying for them. And the cancer doesn't get better, it gets worse. How do we answer that difficult question of, a God who loves us and cares for us, but this child's got cancer?
Yeah, it's certainly not something I think we should be shying away from. I think those big questions are really real, and this, as you say, they're so relevant. We all know people who've gone through that kind of difficult situation, and yeah, and I don't want to sound glib at all when kind of exploring it, so I just want to start off saying that there's not an agreed approach on why is there suffering, but there are different ways that we can think about framing suffering, and how we can think about a good God and suffering together. And I guess what I would say to start off with is that God doesn't shy away from talking about suffering. So we've got the book of Job. And again, there's lots of good people, clever people who talk about, what is the theology of Job and what's it saying. But the main takeaway, I think, at this point is that Job's there. The book of Job is there. And it tells the story. So God he encourages us, I think, to think about this, because he puts it in his book. There's an author and a theologian I'd recommend called Bethany Solarita, and she explores this question really well. And I'm going to borrow off her heavily. So, like I say, there's not an agreed approach, but there might be 4 different ways we can look at the question of suffering and the role of God within that, but also our role within that. So it could be that we might think that, well, God has a plan. There's this bad thing, but God has an overall plan for this suffering, a plan for me, the plan for the people I love. And the role I can play within that is whether to try and seek out and engage with what God's doing there. So that could be one way of thinking about it. Another way could be that actually suffering's an opportunity to draw close to God. So C.S. Lewis, whose work I love, said something along the lines of that pain is God's megaphone into a deaf world. Pain is God's way of reaching out to us and sort of getting us to draw to him. And the choice that we have is whether we choose to answer that drawing. A third way to think about it might be that actually, well, God didn't directly cause the suffering, but he would redeem it now that it's happened, and our choice is to whether to work with him to redeem it. And lastly, another way we can think about it is that, well, actually, it is just all a mystery. but the choice that we have is to whether to surrender to God within that. And so to kind of draw that together and to give some hope, if you're a Christian, you believe Jesus died for you to make a way for you to have make a way for you to sort of have a relationship with God and to spend an eternity with God. So this life is only for now. And there are tough questions, there are really tough situations, but the hope is that that's a temporary thing. In the meantime, we can make sure we just step alongside those who are suffering, whether in a practical or a spiritual sense. It doesn't stop. Thinking about any of this stuff doesn't stop us from being good neighbours, good brothers and sisters to those who are going through it. I hope that kind of approaches the question to some degree. I appreciate that it's a big thing to talk about, so I hope I've answered that okay.
Devinda, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.